All right. Good day, everybody. It's time to go ahead and start with a brand new unit here entitled The Genetics of the Immune System. And my goodness, here we are, social distancing, not able to be together. Because of a virus, obviously. And so, this unit I think you're going to find to be very relevant and very important to you. We're going to look at this really awesome system called the immune system, still quite mysterious in a lot of ways, very intricate system that is constantly working to protect us from things that are in our environment, like viruses and bacteria and fungi, and a very complex and intricate system. And so we're going to learn about how that system works and how it functions and the genetics behind the immune system. And then after that, we're going to do a lesson or two on coronavirus, the novel coronavirus, COVID-19. And I think it'll help us to understand a lot of what's going on today in this world that we live in. So, what I'd like for you to do is go ahead and take out your study guide entitled "The Immune System," and you'll notice there are a fair number of objectives there on the first page of that study guide, and then at the top of the second page. And what I'd like to do here is I want to go ahead and start with page 2 in a sort of a remote lecture here. And so we'll start by first of all looking at the big picture, the organs of the immune system, the main organs. And while I'm talking here, you can go ahead and write out the definitions on page 2 as you take notes as we go along here. We'll start with number 1 up there on page 2, the bone marrow. And there it is. Actually, wait a minute. There it is, bone marrow. And so what we need to write down here is that in the bone marrow, that's where all the precursors of the red and white blood cells are formed. So there are adult stem cells in there in the bone marrow, ring a bell. Adult stem cells that have the potential to develop into all kinds of blood cells, all the different kinds of white blood cells, even platelets, and also red blood cells as well. And then the next item I want to look at here is this gland up here called the thymus. That's number 2. And let's write down for the thymus that that's where special white blood cells called T cells mature and differentiate. So when those adult stem cells mature in the bone marrow and emerge from the bone marrow, some of them differentiate into white blood cells. Certain of those white blood cells will migrate all the way up to the thymus. And in the thymus, they are, like I said, programmed to become all the different kinds of T cells. And we'll look at some of those different kinds of T cells later on. So, in a sense, the the thymus is kind of like, if we use a military analogy throughout our discussion of the immune system, the thymus is a little bit like officer training school. That's where the officers there. That's where the military people in charge are trained, in the thymus. Number 3 on our list, lymph nodes. All right, there's some right there. They're scattered throughout the body. And sometimes, like if you have a bad cold, you may feel them slightly enlarged a little bit in your neck because whenever your body is infected by some kind of a pathogen, then a pathogen is just either a virus or bacterium that can cause disease. That's what a pathogen is. If your body is infected, a lot of times a sign of that will be swollen and painful lymph nodes. And the lymph nodes are a little bit like, and this is what you can write down for number 3, they're a little bit like army bases that store the white blood cells. And we're going to refer to the white blood cells as kind of like the soldiers, if we continue with this military analogy. And so the lymph nodes are a little bit like the army bases where many of these white blood cells are stored. The reason the lymph nodes swell a little bit when there's an infection is because a signal has been sent to increase the numbers of white blood cells. In other words, recruit more troops to fight the infection, and all of that activity in the lymph nodes causes them to swell and actually become sometimes even a little painful. The next item on the list, number 4, lymph vessels. And there's some right there. A system of vessels or tubes that connect the lymph nodes throughout the body. I mean, we're all pretty familiar with the blood vessels that carry blood throughout the body. The lymph vessels carry a kind of a clear liquid called lymph, and it moves from throughout the body, throughout all the interconnected lymph nodes, kind of a highway system that white blood cells will travel on as they go maybe from one part of the body to another wherever an infection is occurring. So they connect the lymph nodes, and you might compare them a little bit to like the interstate highway system that was built in the 1950s. In the 1950s, the Cold War between the United States and what was then the Soviet Union was pretty hot. There was a big threat of people were concerned about communism, and the Soviet Union was sort of our arch rivals. And so the interstate highway system was actually built in the 1950s to provide a complex and efficient highway system that could rapidly move troops and trucks and so on across the country wherever they might be needed in case of invasion. So you can think of the lymphatic vessels as a little bit like the interstate highway system connecting these army bases, that is, these lymph nodes. The next item here, the next organ is the spleen right there. And it's got multiple functions. It's like a really large army base. It stores lots of white blood cells, but the main thing that it does is it disposes of worn out blood cells. And so it's got kind of a double function, but it's also a very large army base, stores a lot of white blood cells that are ready to swing into action in case there's ever an invasion, or more properly, we would say an infection. And you may, I know a guy once who had an accident and his spleen was damaged and he had to surgically have his spleen removed. And so he's going through life without his spleen. You can go through life without your spleen. You may be a little more susceptible to infections, but you can go through life without your spleen because a lot of the other lymph nodes throughout the body are able to kind of pick up the slack. Finally, number 6 on our list, blood vessels. I think we're pretty familiar with those, carry blood throughout the body, pumped by the heart. And what's interesting about the blood vessels is there are white blood cells that have the ability to migrate throughout the body, and they can even pass through the walls of the blood vessels and enter the bloodstream, and then use the bloodstream as kind of a highway system to move from one part of the body to the next. Cool thing about white blood cells, many white blood cells, different kinds of white blood cells, is they're able to move, kind of like an amoeba. They can move, and that gives them a real advantage. Like if there's an infection in one part of the body, then the troops can rapidly be deployed to that part of the body where they're needed. All right, let's take a look at page 3 then. And I referred a little while ago to the fact that there are adult stem cells in the bone marrow that are, again, they're not pluripotent, like remember embryonic stem cells are. They are only multipotent. These adult stem cells in the bone marrow can't develop into any kind of body cells, but they can develop into a lot of different body cells, specifically different kinds of red blood cells and different kinds of white blood cells. And if you'll look at this picture right here on the screen, you can see that on the left-hand side of the diagram here, some of those stem cells will differentiate or develop into what are called B cells. And the way they do that is they differentiate within the bone marrow and then they emerge into the bloodstream. Now, B cells are called that because of B as in bone marrow. They differentiate in the bone marrow. And you can see in the diagram on the left-hand side that what B cells do is they, in turn, if there's an infection moving on down that diagram on the left-hand side of the screen, they can differentiate into special kinds of cells called plasma cells. And plasma cells produce these little Y-shaped proteins called antibodies. And these antibodies are a little bit like missiles that can seek out and attach to invading viruses or bacteria, leading to their destruction. So that's what B cells do. And we're going to be looking more at B cells in detail later on during the lessons as we go, and also the antibodies, those proteins that the B cells produce. On the right-hand side of the diagram, you can see that some of those stem cells actually migrate to the thymus, and we mentioned that just a few minutes ago. They migrate into the thymus, and in the thymus, they differentiate into different kinds of T cells. And again, they're called T cells because of where they differentiate in the thymus. Now, I want to look at page 3 and this diagram right here that shows a response, a branch of the immune system known as the humoral immune response. And we're going to go ahead and fill out the definitions or functions of all of those items there on page 3 of your study guide as we go through this. So I want to start with number 1, antigens. And let's look at what an antigen is. All right, this thing that looks like a purple pill, I guess, a purple pill is actually an invading bacterium that's invaded the body. It's an invader. It's going to cause infection. But notice that this purple bacterium is covered with little red molecules that are called antigens. Antigens are a little bit like name tags. I have on all of the cells of my body special little kind of name tag molecules, antigens, that basically tell my immune system, hey, I'm a friendly. Do not attack me. That's what our cells are covered with, these special molecules called antigens, which notify our immune system that we're not to be attacked. Our tissues are not to be attacked. Now, I have, and I can share this, I don't mind sharing this. I have a disease called an autoimmune disease. Auto as in self. It happens to be a specific type of autoimmune disease called rheumatoid arthritis. Auto, self. Autoimmune disease. What has happened is my immune system, for some reason, and nobody knows why, got a little bit confused like 3 years ago and decided to start to attack the cartilage and the joints in my fingers and wrists. And the cells that make up the cartilage in my fingers and wrists are covered with antigens that basically are little like name tags that say, "Hi, my name's Mr. Ruhl." But for some reason, my immune system got confused, didn't recognize those antigens on my cells in my fingers and wrists as being friendlies, and my immune system decided to attack them, resulting in this autoimmune disease called rheumatoid arthritis. And there are other kinds of autoimmune diseases, for example, like Crohn's disease. And so people with autoimmune diseases have to take medicines that are designed basically to tell the immune system, hey, immune system, chill, chill, stop attacking your own tissues. And so when a bacterium like this purple bacterium in the picture invades the body, the immune system takes a look at those name tag molecules on that bacterium and kind of says, hey, wait a minute. I don't recognize these antigens on the surfaces of these cells, whatever they are, happen to be bacteria. I don't recognize these antigens. We need to attack. We need to attack. And that's what's happening here. And you'll look at if you look at the first step here, and this refers to number 2 on page 3, here's a special kind of a white blood cell called a macrophage. And it's like one of the first responders here. And you can see in this picture on the screen, it looks like it's surrounding and engulfing and eating that purple bacterium. And in fact, that's what it's doing. It's called a macrophage because it's, as far as white blood cells go, it's a big kind of a white blood cell, bigger than most other kinds of white blood cells. That's why it's called macro. Phage means eat. So macrophage literally means big eat. And that's what this thing's doing. Now, so for number 2, you could just write down a large white blood cell that eats foreign invading viruses and bacteria. That's what the macrophage does. But then what the macrophage does next is pretty cool. If you move on down that diagram, what it does is it digests the bacterium, and then what it does down here is it will display on the surface of itself antigens that were on the bacterium that it just ate. See that little red molecule there that it's displaying on its surface? It's almost like a trophy, It's like, hey, look what I just killed. Look what I just ate. And that macrophage then in turn will basically talk to another kind of a white blood cell called a helper T cell. Another kind of a white blood cell called a helper T cell. It communicates with that helper T cell, basically saying, hey, there's an infection, there's an invasion. We need to get the troops all riled up and ready to go here because we need to battle this invasion that's just happened. So what do helper T cells, number 3 on page 3 of your study guide, what do? They basically train. Here's what you can write down. They train or program other white blood cells, such as B cells. And you can see that happening in this picture right here. Check it out. All right, there's the helper T cell talking to, on the right-hand side, a special kind of white blood cell called a B cell. Now, there are 2 kinds of B cells in circulation here. If you go up just above that B cell that's pointed to with the red arrow, you'll see a diagram of a B cell labeled either virgin or memory B cell. Virgin B cells are newly formed B cells. Memory B cells are grizzled veterans from a former infection. For example, when I was in the 1st grade, I got hepatitis, infectious hepatitis, not the kind from a blood transfusion or from sexual intercourse. Duh, I was in the 1st grade. It's kind of it's a kind of hepatitis. It's called hepatitis A or infectious hepatitis that you can get off of a drinking fountain if you're not careful. If somebody who just drank before you was infected. So I had infectious hepatitis. It was like having a stomach bug for a month. I missed a month of first grade. And so this whole humoral response occurred where my B cells started swinging into action um, to ultimately produce antibodies to fight off the infectious hepatitis virus. But then here, how many years later is this? I mean, that was like 1961. I still have grizzled old veterans from that war circulating through my body. They're called memory B cells, and they already know how to make those antibodies. And so they make me basically immune. If I get exposed to hepatitis A again, I won't catch it. The viruses might enter my body, but I've already got those memory B cells hanging around, and they don't have to be programmed. They're all ready to go, grizzled veterans, even though they are. And so they would then kill off the invading viruses before they had a chance to get a foothold. And so we would say in biological language, I'm immune. Thank your memory B cells. You've got memory B cells hanging around in your body for every cold you've ever caught. That's why you'll never catch the exact same cold virus again. It can't get a foothold because of those memory B cells in your body that are ready to go at a moment's notice. So, are you with me? And so what happens is we've got helper T cells that train or program the B cells and get them ready for battle. Now, what do the B cells, whether they're virgin or memory B cells, what do? They, watch this, they differentiate into what are called plasma cells. That's number 5 on page 3. Plasma cells are sometimes called, if you look at the red arrow in the diagram on the screen, they're sometimes called effector B cells. So effector B cells are basically the same thing as plasma cells. And what do plasma cells do? They produce antibodies. So that'd be number 5 on page 3 in your study guide. The plasma cells produce antibodies, and you can see in this diagram that's happening right here. These are these Y-shaped protein molecules spewed out by the plasma cells, and the antibodies act like little missiles that seek out and attach to the invading viruses or bacteria, and this then leads to the destruction of these invaders. So that's what these antibodies do. They're Y-shaped proteins produced by the plasma cells that seek out and attach to they actually attach to the antigens, the name tag molecules, on the surfaces of the invading viruses or bacteria. And here you can see with the red arrow an antibody that is attaching to these name tag molecules, these antigens on the surface of the virus or bacterium. So this is kind of a step-by-step diagram showing what we call the humoral response. Now here's a view inside of a lymph node, magnified view inside of a lymph node. Kind of reminds me of a Star Wars scene a little bit. There's a lot of activity going on here, quite a battle. But let's look at this in detail. If you look at the black arrow in this diagram, you can see a whole horde of invading bacteria coming into the body. This is bad news. Their numbers look great. This body, this person who's been invaded is in trouble, But thank goodness there's a good, intricate, complex, ready to swing into action immune system here ready to go. Let's look at how it works. All right, here's one of the first responders, a macrophage. And if you'll look at that macrophage uh, kind of up close here, look at the black arrow. Notice the extensions coming out of the macrophage. Those are called pseudopods. Pseudo meaning false, pod meaning foot or leg. Pseudopods, these little projections coming out of the macrophage, and they're actually scooping up these bacteria so that the macrophage can pull them in and literally eat them. Here's an enlarged view of that. See the macrophage on the right and the pseudopods extending out, grabbing onto these bacteria, and then it will scoop them in. And it kind of reminds me of a little song that our kids learned when they were little. Little Bunny Foo Foo, but maybe you've heard that song. I don't know. But I better get back on subject here. Okay, so the macrophage is going to eat some of these bacteria. Now, here's an actual photograph taken through an electron microscope of a macrophage it's kind of orange in color. It's been colorized. Reaching out its pseudopods to grab and pull in and digest these hapless little green bacteria. So that's an actual photo right there. All right, back to our view inside the lymph node. So what happens next then is take a look here. The macrophage is going to communicate, actually talks to this little green cell. Let's enlarge that. Called a helper T cell. Okay, so we're just kind of reviewing here those structures that we wrote down the definitions and functions for on page 3 of your study guide. So in this picture, you can see the macrophage communicating with the helper T cell, basically saying, hey, look what I just ate. There's an invasion here. We need to get the troops going. So what happens next is the helper T cell will communicate, as you can see right here, represented by little bolts of kind of lightning here, communicates with a B cell. And basically, here's our B cell. And the T cell, in a sense, trains or programs the B cell to produce specific kinds of antibodies that will attack these particular specific types of invading microbes. That's what's going to happen. And here you can see it. Here's our B cell on the left. When the B cell gets that message, then the B cell will differentiate or develop into this plasma cell on the right. And then the next step is the plasma cell will start spewing out, manufacturing these antibodies. Right there they are, a bunch of antibodies. And you can see the antibodies right here then will attach to these microbes, these invading bacteria. And this macrophage then will scoop them up even more. So the antibodies, in a sense, cause all of these bacteria to start clumping up in groups and softening up these bacteria so that the macrophages can come in and really clean up big time. Now there's something else interesting that happens here. If you look down here in the lower left-hand corner of this view inside the lymph node, there's some little blue protein molecules. There they are. You see them? There's a antibody there attached to that bacterium, and these little blue protein molecules are called complement, and that's number 8 in your list of structures there on page 3 in your study guide. That's called complement. Complement are special protein bodies protein molecules, I should say, produced by the immune system that when the antibodies, the Y-shaped proteins, mark the bacteria or virus, that that signals these complement protein molecules to come in and puncture holes in the bacterium or the virus, causing the bacterium or virus to literally explode, destroying the invader. So that's kind of cool. So here's how a case of where some antibodies, when they attach to the invaders, the antibody itself works a little bit like a laser that lights up the target, and then the complement proteins are a little bit like the laser guided missiles that then come in and destroy the target. So it's an intricate system, very cool the way it works. Well, I think it's cool anyway. All right, so I think this is probably a good place to stop for today. But what we need to be doing next is I want us to look at just what an antibody really is. What are the parts of an antibody? Uh, how are they constructed? And how are antibodies formed? So we'll stop here for today. That's enough information for today. And starting next time, we'll investigate further just what antibodies are, how they're put together, and how they're made by the immune system, by specifically the plasma cells.